I can still smell the antiseptic and fear that filled room 314 at St. Mary's Hospital the day my world cracked in half. The morning sun was streaming through those industrial windows that never quite let in enough light, casting everything in a sickly yellow glow that made my already pale skin look corpse-like. I was wearing one of those hospital gowns that somehow manages to be both too big and too small at the same time, my hands shaking as I waited for Dr. Martinez to return with test results that would either save my life or end it. My name is Isabella Rodriguez, and this is the story of how overhearing one cruel whisper in a hospital hallway taught me that sometimes the best revenge is simply refusing to die. But to understand why those words hit me like a physical blow, you need to know how I ended up in that hospital bed in the first place, and why the person who said them had every reason to believe I wouldn't be leaving alive. It started 18 months earlier, with what I thought was just exhaustion that I couldn't shake, no matter how much coffee I drank or how many vitamins I took. I was Isabella Rodriguez then, though I went by Isabella Chen after my marriage, one of those small compromises that seemed insignificant at the time but later felt like losing pieces of myself one decision at a time. For months, I'd been telling myself it was just stress from work, from the divorce proceedings with Michael, from trying to rebuild my life at 34 after 15 years of marriage fell apart like a house of cards in a hurricane. I was working double shifts at the pediatric clinic where I'd been a nurse practitioner for 8 years, partly because I loved the work and partly because I needed every penny I could earn to pay for the lawyer who was fighting to get me a fair settlement. The pediatric clinic was my sanctuary, the one place where I felt genuinely useful and appreciated. Children don't lie about how they feel, don't manipulate situations for personal gain, don't calculate the value of your kindness against their own interests. When 8-year-old Marcus, yes, the same name as my husband, the universe has a cruel sense of humor, would light up because I remembered his favorite dinosaur, or when teenage Sophia would finally open up about her anxiety because I'd taken the time to really listen, I remembered why I'd chosen healthcare in the first place. I'd wanted to be a pediatric nurse since I was 12 years old and spent 3 weeks in the hospital after a car accident that killed my parents and left me with a shattered pelvis and a completely shattered life. The nurses at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia weren't just medical professionals, they were the people who held my hand during panic attacks, who smuggled in my favorite cookies when I couldn't stomach hospital food, who made me laugh when I thought I'd never laugh again. Nurse Rebecca Williams, in particular, had changed my life. She worked the night shift and would sit with me during those long, dark hours when the pain medication wore off and the reality of being an orphan felt too heavy to bear. She never told me everything would be okay, she was too honest for empty platitudes, but she did tell me that I was stronger than I knew, and that strength would carry me through things I couldn't yet imagine. "Pain changes you, Isabella," she'd said one night when I was crying about missing my parents' funeral because I was still in traction. "But you get to choose how it changes you. You can let it make you bitter, or you can let it make you compassionate. You can let it close your heart, or you can let it break your heart open so wide that you can hold other people's pain without drowning in it." I'd carried those words with me through foster care, through college, through nursing school, through 8 years of pediatric practice. Pain had indeed changed me, but I tried to let it make me more compassionate, more present with patients who were scared and hurting and needed someone to see them as more than just their diagnosis. Which is why Michael's betrayal had cut so deep. After 15 years of marriage, I thought I'd found someone who understood that my capacity for compassion wasn't weakness, that my dedication to my patients wasn't just a job but a calling. I thought I'd married someone who valued those qualities in me. Instead, I'd married someone who saw them as character flaws to be managed and eventually corrected. Michael had been many things during our marriage, charming when he wanted something, successful in the shallow way that impresses people at cocktail parties, manipulative in ways so subtle I didn't recognize them until years later, unfaithful in ways he somehow convinced me were my fault for not being understanding enough of his needs. But he'd never been generous, and he'd certainly never been supportive of what he called my martyr complex around patient care. "You care too much, Isabella," he'd say when I'd come home exhausted from a particularly difficult day with a child who was dying or a family that was falling apart under the stress of medical crisis. "You can't save everyone, and it's not healthy to try." He made caring sound like a character defect. He made compassion sound like poor professional boundaries. He made my calling sound like an obsession that was damaging our marriage and preventing me from focusing on what he considered more important: his career, his social obligations, his vision of what our life together should look like. When I finally found the courage to leave him after discovering his third affair, this time with his dental hygienist, because apparently my husband was a walking cliché, he made it clear that he intended to keep as much of our assets as possible and make the process as difficult and expensive as he could. The beautiful house in Westchester that I'd helped design and decorate, choosing every paint color and light fixture with the care of someone creating a home rather than just a showplace? He claimed it was mostly his investment because his income had paid the mortgage. The savings account we built together over 15 years, including money I'd contributed from my salary and a small inheritance from my foster grandmother? Apparently, his higher salary meant he deserved the larger share. Even my car, a Honda Accord that had been a gift for my 30th birthday, somehow became community property that needed to be fairly divided. The cruelest part was how he used my compassion against me in the proceedings. When I'd argue for keeping furniture that had sentimental value, like the rocking chair where I'd sat with him during his father's final illness, or the dining room table where we'd hosted Thanksgiving for his family every year, he'd paint me as emotional and unreasonable, someone who was letting feelings cloud her judgment about financial realities. Your Honor, his lawyer would say, my client's wife seems unable to separate sentiment from sound financial planning. We're trying to reach a practical resolution, but she's making it difficult by assigning emotional value to depreciating assets. Depreciating assets. That's what 15 years of building a life together had become in legal documents: depreciating assets to be liquidated and divided. So I worked 60-hour weeks, picking up extra shifts, covering for colleagues who called in sick, taking on consulting work for other pediatric practices. I told myself the exhaustion was temporary, that once the divorce was finalized and I could start over, I'd have time to rest, to take care of myself, to figure out who Isabella Rodriguez was when she wasn't being Michael's wife or Michael's problem to be solved. But the exhaustion got worse instead of better. Then came the bruises that appeared without explanation, purple and yellow blooms across my arms and legs that I couldn't remember earning. I'd find them when I was getting dressed in the morning: a handprint-sized bruise on my thigh, finger-shaped marks on my upper arms, a dark smudge along my ribs that looked like I'd walked into something sharp. At first, I attributed them to clumsiness brought on by stress and fatigue. I was working long hours, sleeping poorly, probably bumping into things without noticing. But when my patient's parents started asking if I was feeling all right, their concerned faces making me realize that whatever was happening to me was visible to others, I began to worry that something more serious was wrong. Miss Isabella, are you sick? 6-year-old Emma Patterson asked during one of her routine checkups. Emma was a patient I'd been seeing since she was 2, a precocious little girl who noticed everything and had no filter between her observations and her mouth. I'm just tired, sweetheart, I told her, but her mother was looking at me with the same concerned expression. Isabella, you look pale, Mrs. Patterson said gently. And you seem to have lost weight. Are you taking care of yourself? Mrs. Patterson was a nurse herself, working in geriatrics at a nursing home across town. She knew the signs of someone who was pushing too hard and not paying attention to their own health. I'm fine, I insisted, but even as I said it, I could feel how hollow the words sounded. I wasn't fine. I was the opposite of fine. I was running on fumes and stubbornness, held together by caffeine and the desperate need to prove to Michael's lawyers that I was competent and stable and deserving of a fair settlement. The final straw came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was drawing blood from 7-year-old Emma Patterson, the same Emma who'd asked if I was sick, for routine lab work when the room started spinning. The sensation came on so suddenly that I didn't have time to sit down or call for help. One moment I was labeling the blood sample, and the next moment the floor was rushing up to meet me. I managed to finish the draw and get Emma her promised butterfly sticker, but the moment her mother led her out of the room, asking worried questions about whether I was all right, I collapsed into the chair and put my head between my knees, trying to stop the world from tilting sideways. Dr. Sarah Kim, the pediatrician I work most closely with, found me there 10 minutes later, still dizzy and now nauseous as well. Isabella, what happened? She asked, her voice sharp with concern. I just got a little lightheaded, I said, trying to minimize what had clearly been more than a little anything. I probably need to eat something. But Sarah had known me for 5 years, and she could tell the difference between someone who needed a snack and someone who needed medical attention. "When's the last time you had a physical?" she asked. I couldn't remember. Sometime before the divorce proceedings started, certainly. Maybe 2 years ago? Healthcare workers are notoriously bad at seeking healthcare for themselves, and I'd been so focused on work and legal battles that I'd completely neglected my own well-being. "We're going to the ER, Sarah said firmly. "Right now." "I can't," I protested. "I have 3 more patients this afternoon, and—" "Isabella." Sarah's voice had the authority of someone who'd spent years making medical decisions for people who didn't want to hear them. "You just nearly fainted while drawing blood from a child. That's not stress or fatigue or not eating enough breakfast. That's your body telling you something is seriously wrong." She was right, of course. Deep down, I knew she was right. But admitting that meant admitting that I wasn't as strong as I'd been pretending to be, that the stress of the divorce and the demands of work had pushed me past my limits, that I might be seriously ill at the worst possible time in my life. I woke up in the ER of my own hospital, which was mortifying in ways I couldn't have imagined. My colleagues, people I work with every day, were now taking my vital signs and asking about my symptoms with the kind of professional sympathy I'd given to thousands of patients over the years. The role reversal was disorienting and deeply uncomfortable. "Isabella," Dr. Sarah Kim said, sitting on the edge of my bed with the careful posture of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to share. "We need to run some tests. Your blood work is concerning." Concerning. In medical speak, that word carries the weight of 1,000 possibilities, most of them bad. The tests came back 3 days later. Acute myeloid leukemia. AML. The kind of cancer that moves fast and hits hard, the kind that requires immediate, aggressive treatment and still only offers a coin flip's chance of survival. Dr. Martinez, the oncologist they'd brought in to manage my case, was kind but direct in the way doctors learn to be when they deliver death sentences for a living. "Isabella, I'm not going to sugarcoat this. AML is aggressive, and yours is particularly advanced. We caught it relatively early, which is good, but you're looking at months of intensive chemotherapy, possible radiation, and if we're lucky, a bone marrow transplant." If we're lucky. Even the optimistic scenario sounded like hell. "What are my chances?" I asked, because I'm a medical professional and I needed the real numbers, not the hopeful platitudes. "With aggressive treatment, we're looking at about a 60% chance of remission. But Isabella, this is going to be the fight of your life. The treatment is going to make you sicker before it makes you better. You're going to lose your hair, your energy, probably a significant amount of weight. There will be days when you question whether it's worth it." 60%. Better than a coin flip, but not by much. I called Michael from my hospital bed, partly because he was still legally my next of kin and partly because 15 years of marriage creates habits that are hard to break, even when the marriage is broken beyond repair. "Cancer?" he said, and I could hear him processing this information, calculating how it might affect the divorce proceedings. "Jesus, Isabella. That's terrible. Are you going to be okay?" "I don't know," I said honestly. "It's going to be a long treatment process. Months of chemo, maybe longer." There was a pause that went on too long. "Well," he said finally, "I guess this changes things with the divorce timeline. Not how can I help you? Or what do you need? Or even I'm sorry this is happening to you. Just a calculation about how my potential death might affect his legal strategy." "Michael," I said, my voice getting sharper, "I have cancer. I might die. Does that register with you at all?" "Of course it registers," he said, but his tone suggested I was being dramatic. "It's just that we had court dates scheduled, and if you're going to be in treatment." I hung up on him. After 15 years of marriage, I hung up on my husband while calling to tell him I had cancer, because he was more concerned about court dates than my life. That's when I realized I was truly alone in this fight. The next few days were a blur of consultations, treatment plans, and medical forms that felt like planning my own funeral. They moved me to the oncology ward, room 314, which became my temporary home while they prepared to pump poison into my veins in the hope of killing the cancer before it killed me. The oncology ward is a strange place, full of people in various stages of fighting for their lives. Some are winning, some are losing, and most are somewhere in the exhausting middle of the battle. The nursing staff develops a particular kind of professional warmth, the kind that acknowledges the gravity of the situation while maintaining enough emotional distance to function. Most of them, anyway. Nurse Patricia Hendricks was different. She'd been working oncology for 15 years, according to the other staff, and had developed what could charitably be called a realistic perspective on patient outcomes. Less charitably, she'd become callous in a way that made her colleagues uncomfortable and her patients feel like statistics instead of people. She was in her early 50s, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of permanent frown lines that suggested she'd forgotten how to smile years ago. When she took my vitals, she was efficient but cold, answering my questions with the minimum information required and offering no comfort or encouragement. "How long have you been doing oncology nursing?" I asked during one of her visits, trying to make conversation. "Long enough to know how these things usually go," she replied, not looking up from her chart. It wasn't exactly bedside manner, but I understood that working with dying people could make you build walls. I developed my own emotional defenses during my years in pediatrics, though I tried to maintain my compassion even when protecting my heart. What I didn't know was that Patricia had already decided I was a lost cause. What I didn't know was that she'd been watching my case progression, observing my physical decline, and making her own grim calculations about my chances. What I didn't know was that she'd been discussing those calculations with other people, including the one person who had the most to gain from my death. I found out 3 weeks into my treatment, on a Thursday afternoon when I was feeling particularly weak from the latest round of chemotherapy. I'd been dozing off and on, drifting in that strange half-sleep that chemo patients learn to navigate, when I heard familiar voices in the hallway outside my room. The first voice belonged to Patricia. The second voice belonged to my soon-to-be ex-husband. Chapter 2, The Whisper That Changed Everything. I hadn't heard Michael's voice in 2 weeks, not since that disastrous phone call where he'd been more concerned about court dates than my cancer diagnosis. So when I heard him talking to Patricia in the hallway outside my room, my first thought was confusion. Why was he here? And why was he talking to my nurse like they knew each other? The chemo had made me hypersensitive to sound. Every beep, every footstep, every whispered conversation seemed amplified. I could hear them clearly through the thin walls of room 314, though they obviously thought they were speaking quietly enough to avoid being overheard. "How much longer are we talking about?" Michael was asking. "Hard to say," Patricia replied. "These cases can drag on for months, but honestly, she's not responding as well as we'd hoped. The cancer is aggressive, and she's already lost significant weight. Her blood counts are concerning." My heart started racing. They were talking about me like I was a case study, not a human being fighting for her life. "But she could still recover?" Michael asked, and something in his tone made my skin crawl. He didn't sound like a husband hoping for good news. He sounded like someone calculating odds. "Anything's possible," Patricia said, "but between you and me, I've seen a lot of these cases. The ones who make it usually show more fight than she's showing. She spends most of her time sleeping, barely eats, doesn't seem to have much motivation for the treatment." She was describing the normal effects of chemotherapy like they were character flaws. I was sleeping because the treatment was exhausting. I wasn't eating because food tasted like metal and made me nauseous. I wasn't showing fight because I was using every ounce of energy I had just to survive each day. "So what are you saying?" Michael asked. There was a pause that seemed to last forever. Then Patricia said the words that would change everything. "I'm saying you might want to start thinking about making arrangements. She'll die soon anyway. She'll die soon anyway." 6 words that hit me like a physical blow. 6 words that revealed not just Patricia's unprofessional callousness, but Michael's reason for being there. He wasn't visiting out of concern or love or even basic human decency. He was getting updates on my condition from my nurse so he could plan for my death. So he could know when to start celebrating his freedom from alimony, when to stop worrying about dividing assets, when to begin his life as a widower instead of a divorcee. And there's no chance she's faking how sick she is? Michael asked. I mean, she's always been dramatic about illness. Always been dramatic about illness. I was lying in a hospital bed, bald from chemotherapy, fighting for my life, and he was suggesting I might be faking it for attention. Michael, Patricia said, and I could hear the amusement in her voice, you can't fake the kind of blood work she's showing. You can't fake the weight loss or the way the cancer is spreading. Trust me, this isn't performance art. She's genuinely dying. She's genuinely dying. They both laughed at that, like it was a private joke they shared. I lay in my hospital bed, connected to machines that were monitoring my failing body, listening to my husband and my nurse discuss my impending death with the casual tone people use to talk about weekend plans. How long do these things usually take? Michael asked. Could be weeks, could be months. But honestly, she's deteriorating faster than most. I'd be surprised if she makes it to Christmas. It was November 15th. Christmas was 6 weeks away. That would actually be perfect timing, Michael said. The divorce proceedings would be moot, and I could focus on settling the estate. Perfect timing. My death would have perfect timing for his legal strategy. Just remember, Patricia said, you didn't hear any of this from me. I could lose my license for sharing patient information. Of course, Michael said. I was never here. I heard footsteps moving away from my door, then silence. I lay there in the growing darkness of my hospital room, processing what I'd just learned. My nurse had decided I was going to die and was sharing confidential medical information with my estranged husband. My husband was visiting the hospital not to support me, but to get intelligence about when he'd be free of me permanently. The people who were supposed to be caring for me were actively rooting for my death. For the first time since my diagnosis, I cried. Not the dignified tears of someone processing grief, but the ugly, desperate sobs of someone who just realized they were completely alone in the world. I cried for the marriage that had never been what I thought it was. I cried for the trust I'd placed in medical professionals who saw me as a case number instead of a human being. I cried for the future I'd been planning that now seemed impossible. But somewhere in the middle of that breakdown, something shifted. The despair transformed into something harder, sharper, more dangerous. Anger. Pure, crystalline rage at the injustice of it all. At Patricia's casual cruelty. At Michael's calculating selfishness. At the assumption that I would die quietly and conveniently, solving everyone's problems by simply ceasing to exist. I stopped crying and started planning. If they wanted to treat my life like a game, I would show them how the game was really played. If they thought I was too weak to fight back, I would prove them wrong in the most spectacular way possible. If they were counting on me to die soon anyway, I was going to live just to spite them. But first, I needed proof of what I'd overheard. Hospital hallway conversations wouldn't hold up in court, and I needed documentation of Patricia's violation of patient confidentiality if I was going to make her pay for her cruelty. I needed to be smart about this. Strategic. Clinical. I needed to think like the medical professional I was, instead of the dying patient they assumed I'd become. Over the next few days, I began to observe Patricia more carefully. I noticed when she made her rounds, how she interacted with other patients, when she took her breaks. I started keeping a journal of every interaction we had, documenting her dismissive comments and unprofessional behavior. But most importantly, I started listening. Really listening. To the conversations she had with other staff, to the phone calls she took at the nurse's station, to the casual comments she made about patients when she thought no one was paying attention. What I discovered was that Patricia's violation of my privacy wasn't an isolated incident. She routinely discussed patient information inappropriately, made cruel jokes about terminal diagnoses, and treated people fighting for their lives like they were inconveniences to be managed rather than human beings deserving of dignity and care. She was a bully who'd found the perfect victims, people too sick to fight back, too vulnerable to complain, too focused on survival to challenge her behavior. But I wasn't too sick to fight back. Not anymore. The anger had given me something I'd been lacking since my diagnosis: purpose. I had a reason to get better now, beyond just surviving the cancer. I had a mission. I was going to expose Patricia Hendricks for what she really was. I was going to make sure Michael's calculations about my convenient death were spectacularly wrong. And I was going to do it all while beating the cancer that they'd already written me off for. Because if there's one thing I'd learned in 8 years of pediatric nursing, it's that the human body is capable of incredible things when the human spirit refuses to give up. And my spirit wasn't just refusing to give up anymore. It was getting ready for war. Chapter 3, The Plan Takes Shape. The next 2 weeks were the most difficult of my treatment, but they were also when everything started to change. The combination of fury and purpose was like rocket fuel for my recovery. While Patricia continued to treat me like a lost cause and Michael presumably continued planning for his widowhood, I was quietly building a case that would destroy them both. My first advantage was that everyone underestimated me. Patricia saw a dying woman too weak to be a threat. Michael saw a sick ex-wife who would conveniently solve his financial problems by ceasing to exist. Neither of them realized that I was a healthcare professional with 8 years of experience navigating hospital politics and medical ethics. My second advantage was that I had nothing but time. Hours and hours every day to observe, to listen, to document, and to plan. I started with Patricia's routine. She worked the day shift, 7 a.m. to 7 p.m., 3 days a week. She took her breaks at predictable times, always at the same bench in the hospital courtyard where she thought no one could hear her phone conversations. She had access to the computer system that contained all patient records, and she was careless about logging out of her terminal. Most importantly, she was arrogant. 15 years of getting away with unprofessional behavior had made her confident that she was untouchable, that patients were too sick and families too distracted to pose any real threat to her job security. She was about to learn how wrong she was. My first step was documenting everything. I bought a small digital recorder and started keeping detailed notes about every interaction. Patricia's dismissive comments about my treatment. Her casual discussions of other patients' conditions within earshot of visitors. Her habit of rolling her eyes when patients asked questions about their care. But I needed more than just documentation of unprofessional behavior. I needed proof of actual policy violations, things that would get her fired rather than just reprimanded. The breakthrough came during my 3rd week of surveillance, when I overheard Patricia on the phone in the courtyard during her afternoon break. "I'm telling you, she's not going to make it," she was saying. "The cancer's too advanced, and she doesn't have the fight in her. Her husband's already asking about timelines." My blood ran cold. She was discussing my case with someone outside the hospital, someone who had no right to my medical information. I positioned myself closer to the window and turned on my recorder. "No, he's not listed as emergency contact anymore," Patricia continued. "They're in the middle of a divorce. But between you and me, he's going to inherit everything when she dies, so I don't see the harm in keeping him informed." There it was. Explicit admission that she was sharing confidential patient information with someone who had no legal right to it, and that she was doing it because she believed it served Michael's financial interests. But who was she talking to? I needed to know who else was involved in this conspiracy. Over the next few days, I pieced together the answer through careful eavesdropping and some strategic questions to other staff members. Patricia's daughter worked as a paralegal at a law firm. The same law firm that was representing Michael in our divorce. The web of corruption was bigger than I'd imagined. Patricia wasn't just casually sharing information with Michael, she was actively feeding intelligence to his legal team through her daughter, helping them strategize around my expected death. They were all counting on me to die conveniently, solving their professional and personal problems by simply ceasing to be an obstacle. I decided it was time to give them exactly what they wanted. Or at least, to make them think they were getting it. I started playing up my symptoms around Patricia. When she checked on me, I made sure to seem weaker, more defeated, less responsive to treatment. I stopped asking questions about my care. I picked at my food and left most of it uneaten. I spent more time sleeping, or pretending to sleep. To Patricia, I looked like a patient who was giving up, confirming her assessment that I lacked the fight necessary to beat the cancer. But during the hours when she wasn't around, I was working. Physical therapy with the other nurses to rebuild my strength. Meditation and visualization exercises to manage the stress and anxiety. research into treatment options and second opinions that might improve my prognosis. Most importantly, I was building relationships with the other staff members, the ones who actually cared about their patients and took their professional responsibilities seriously. Nurse Jennifer Walsh had been working oncology for 5 years and was everything Patricia wasn't: compassionate, professional, and genuinely invested in her patients' well-being. She'd noticed Patricia's behavior but, like many healthcare workers, had been reluctant to report a colleague without clear evidence of wrongdoing. "I've always felt uncomfortable with how she talks about patients," Jennifer confided to me during one of her shifts. "But she's been here so long, and she's careful about not saying anything too explicit in front of management." What if someone had recordings of her discussing patient information inappropriately? I asked carefully. Jennifer's eyes widened. That would be a serious HIPAA violation. Career ending, actually. Why? Just curious about how these things work, I said. Hypothetically. But Jennifer was smarter than I was giving her credit for. "Isabella, if you're dealing with something involving Patricia, you need to be very careful. She has friends in administration, and she's been known to retaliate against patients who complain about her." Retaliate against patients. The phrase sent a chill down my spine, but it also reinforced my determination to expose her. How many other vulnerable people had Patricia bullied into silence? What kind of retaliation? I asked. Little things. Forgetting to refill pain medication on time. Being slower to respond to call buttons. Making patients feel like they're being difficult for having basic needs. She was describing a systematic pattern of abuse, enabled by a power structure that protected nurses over patients and prioritized avoiding complaints over ensuring quality care. But Patricia had made one crucial mistake: she'd targeted someone who understood the system well enough to use it against her. I spent the next week gathering more evidence. I recorded Patricia discussing other patients' conditions in public areas. I documented her failure to follow proper protocols for patient confidentiality. I photographed her accessing patient records on computers she'd left unsecured. But the piece de resistance came when I overheard another phone conversation, this one even more damning than the first. "The divorce lawyer wants to know about her mental state," Patricia was saying. "Whether she's competent to make decisions about the settlement." My hands started shaking as I realized what she was suggesting. Not only was she sharing my medical information illegally, she was helping Michael's legal team build a case that I was mentally incompetent due to my illness. "I can't officially say she's not competent," Patricia continued, "but I can document concerns about her decision-making capacity. Depression from the diagnosis, medication side effects affecting cognition, that sort of thing." She was planning to fabricate evidence of mental incompetence to help Michael gain control of our assets before I died. This wasn't just unprofessional behavior anymore. This was fraud. This was conspiracy. This was a criminal enterprise designed to steal from a dying woman. But I wasn't dying. Not anymore. The anger had been replaced by something colder and more focused: determination. I was going to survive this cancer, and I was going to make sure everyone who counted on my death paid the price for their cruelty. I had everything I needed to destroy Patricia's career and expose Michael's conspiracy. But I wanted to do it in a way that would have maximum impact, that would ensure they never had the opportunity to victimize anyone else. I wanted to do it in a way that would be absolutely, perfectly, devastatingly public. Which is why I decided to wait until my discharge day to spring my trap. Chapter 4: The Discharge That Changed Everything. 6 months after Patricia whispered that I'd die soon anyway, I was sitting in room 314 waiting for my discharge papers. The cancer was in remission, my blood counts were normal, and my oncologist had cleared me to return to work part-time. I'd gained back most of the weight I'd lost, my hair was growing back in silver curls that I'd decided to keep, and for the first time in months, I felt genuinely strong. More importantly, I felt ready. The evidence I'd gathered over the past 6 months was comprehensive and damning. Hours of recorded conversations. Documented violations of patient privacy. Proof of Patricia's conspiracy with Michael's legal team to share confidential medical information. Screenshots of her accessing patient records inappropriately. Testimony from other patients who'd experienced her unprofessional behavior. But the most powerful piece of evidence was something I'd been working on for the past month, a complete recovery that made a mockery of Patricia's confident predictions about my imminent death. Dr. Martinez had been amazed by my turnaround. Isabella, I have to be honest with you. When you first came in, I was worried we might lose you. Your case was aggressive, and you seemed so defeated in those early weeks. But something changed. You found a will to live that made all the difference in your treatment response. If only he knew what had really motivated my recovery. I timed my discharge for a Tuesday morning, when Patricia would be working and the administrative staff would be available to deal with what I was about to unleash. I'd also arranged for a few witnesses to be present, people whose testimony would be crucial to ensuring that justice was served. Jennifer Walsh was working that day, as was Dr. Martinez. I'd also invited my new lawyer, Maria Santos, who specialized in medical malpractice and privacy violations. Most importantly, I contacted the hospital's chief compliance officer, David Chen, and requested that he be present for my discharge. It's unusual to have so many people involved in a routine discharge, he'd said when I called to arrange the meeting. Trust me, I'd replied. This won't be routine. At 10 a.m., everyone gathered in my room. Patricia arrived looking annoyed at the crowd, clearly wondering why a simple discharge required so much attention. Let's get this over with, she said, pulling out the standard discharge paperwork. You'll need to sign these forms acknowledging that you understand your follow-up care instructions. Actually, I said, before we do the discharge, I have something I need to share with everyone. I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder containing 6 months of evidence. I've been documenting some concerning behavior during my stay here, and I believe everyone needs to hear what I've discovered. Patricia's face went pale. I don't know what you think you're doing, but I'm doing what I should have done months ago, I said. I'm reporting a systematic pattern of patient privacy violations, unprofessional conduct, and conspiracy to commit fraud. I started with the recordings. Patricia's voice filled the room, discussing my case with Michael, sharing confidential information with her daughter, plotting to fabricate evidence of mental incompetence. She'll die soon anyway, Patricia's recorded voice said, and everyone in the room turned to stare at her with expressions of horror and disgust. This is taken out of context, Patricia stammered. You were just violating HIPAA regulations, sharing confidential patient information with unauthorized persons, and conspiring with my estranged husband to defraud me, I said calmly. But there's more. I played the recording of her discussing my supposed mental incompetence with Michael's legal team. I showed the screenshots of her accessing patient records inappropriately. I presented documentation of her unprofessional behavior toward multiple patients over the course of months. But the piece de resistance was a folder I'd labeled expected versus actual outcomes. 6 months ago, I said, Nurse Hendricks told my estranged husband that I would likely be dead by Christmas. She made this assessment not based on medical expertise, but based on her personal opinion that I lacked the fight necessary to survive treatment. I opened the folder to reveal my latest test results, my clean bill of health, my doctor's confirmation that I was in complete remission. As you can see, I continued, her assessment was somewhat inaccurate. The silence in the room was deafening. Patricia looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. David Chen was taking notes furiously. Dr. Martinez looked like he was processing the full scope of what he was hearing. But the most disturbing part, I continued, isn't just that Nurse Hendricks violated my privacy and conspired against my interests. It's that she did it while I was at my most vulnerable, when I was fighting for my life and depending on medical professionals to care for me with integrity and compassion. I turned to face Patricia directly. You decided I was going to die, and instead of using that belief to motivate better care, you used it as an excuse to treat me as less than human. You shared my private medical information with people who wanted to profit from my death. You plotted to fabricate evidence that would undermine my legal rights. You turned my illness into an opportunity for cruelty. Patricia's mouth was opening and closing like a fish out of water. I never. This is all documented, recorded, and witnessed, I said. And it ends now. I turned to David Chen. I'm filing formal complaints with the hospital administration, the state nursing board, and the Department of Health and Human Services. I'm also pursuing legal action for violation of privacy, conspiracy to commit fraud, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Then I turned to Dr. Martinez. Doctor, I want you to know that your care was exemplary. My recovery had nothing to do with Nurse Hendricks and everything to do with medical professionals like you who treated me with dignity and skill. Finally, I turned back to Patricia, who was now crying and trying to find words to defend herself. Patricia, I said, you told my husband I'd die soon anyway. You were wrong about that, just like you were wrong about everything else. I'm not dying. I'm not giving up. And I'm not going away. I stood up from my bed, fully dressed and stronger than I'd been in months. I'm going home. I'm going back to work. I'm going to live a long, healthy, happy life. And every day that I'm alive and thriving will be a reminder that you were wrong about me. I picked up my discharge papers and signed them with a flourish. Thank you all for coming, I said. I think this discharge is complete. As I walked out of room 314 for the last time, I could hear the chaos erupting behind me. David Chen was already on the phone with hospital administration. Jennifer was providing additional testimony about Patricia's behavior. Dr. Martinez was reviewing my case files to see what he might have missed. And Patricia was finally experiencing what it felt like to have her professional life crumble around her, just like she'd helped Michael try to do to me. 2 weeks later, Patricia was terminated for cause. Her nursing license was suspended pending investigation. Michael's divorce lawyer withdrew from the case when the evidence of their conspiracy came to light. And I was back at work, healthy and strong and more determined than ever to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. But the most satisfying moment came 6 months later, when I ran into Patricia at a grocery store. She looked older, defeated, like someone who'd finally faced consequences for her actions. Isabella, she said, clearly uncomfortable. I wanted to apologize. I know what I did was wrong. Patricia, I said, you didn't just do something wrong. You forgot what it means to be a nurse. You forgot that patients are human beings deserving of dignity and care, especially when they're at their most vulnerable. She nodded, tears in her eyes. I know. I've had a lot of time to think about it. Good, I said. Maybe you can use that time to figure out who you want to be next, because the person you were in that hospital isn't someone I'd trust to care for anyone. As I walked away, I felt something I hadn't expected, peace. Not because I'd gotten revenge, but because I'd gotten justice. Not just for myself, but for every patient who'd been mistreated by someone who'd forgotten that healing requires compassion as much as competence. I'd proven that sometimes the best response to cruelty isn't cruelty in return. Sometimes it's simply refusing to let cruelty win. Epilogue, 3 years later. I'm writing this from my new office at St. Mary's Hospital, where I now work as the Patient Advocate Coordinator, a position created specifically to prevent the kind of abuse I experienced 3 years ago. The irony isn't lost on me that I'm now working in the same hospital where Patricia once whispered that I'd die soon anyway. The cancer has been in remission for over 3 years now. I've remarried to David, the compliance officer who helped expose Patricia's corruption and became much more than a professional colleague. We have a small house with a garden where I grow vegetables and flowers, spending time in the soil that reminds me daily that life finds a way to flourish even after the darkest winters. But the most meaningful part of my new life is the work. Every day, I meet with patients and families who are navigating the healthcare system at their most vulnerable moments. I help them understand their rights, advocate for better care, and ensure that they're treated with the dignity and compassion that every human being deserves. I've helped expose 2 more cases of patient abuse, implemented new training protocols for nursing staff, and created a confidential reporting system that makes it easier for patients to speak up when they experience unprofessional treatment. The work is sometimes heartbreaking, but it's also deeply satisfying. Every patient who feels heard, every family that gets better care, every staff member who learns to lead with compassion instead of convenience, it all feels like a way of honoring the person I was in room 314, fighting for her life while the people supposed to care for her were planning for her death. Patricia never worked as a nurse again. Her license was permanently revoked after the investigation revealed a pattern of patient abuse spanning several years. She eventually moved to another state, where I heard she's working in medical billing, a job that keeps her away from direct patient care. I don't take satisfaction in her downfall anymore. What I feel instead is sadness for all the patients who suffered under her care, and gratitude that her ability to cause harm has been permanently removed. Michael's story had a different ending, but no less fitting. When the evidence of his conspiracy with Patricia came to light during our divorce proceedings, his own lawyer advised him to settle quickly and quietly to avoid criminal charges for fraud and conspiracy. He ended up with far less than he'd hoped for, and his reputation in his professional circles was permanently damaged when word got out about his attempt to profit from his wife's terminal illness. He remarried within a year, to his secretary, which was so predictable it was almost funny. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she left him 18 months later, taking half of what little he had left after our settlement. I don't take satisfaction in that either, really. What I feel is profound gratitude that I'm no longer married to someone capable of such calculated cruelty. The most surprising outcome of the whole experience has been the letters. Over the past 3 years, I've received hundreds of letters from patients, families, and healthcare workers who heard about my story and wanted to share their own experiences with medical abuse, neglect, or advocacy. Many of them are heartbreaking stories of people who were too sick, too scared, or too powerless to fight back against professionals who forgot their duty to first do no harm. But many others are inspiring stories of people who found the courage to speak up, to demand better care, to refuse to accept that being sick means accepting being treated poorly. Last month, I got a letter that made me cry, happy tears this time. It was from a young woman named Sarah who'd been diagnosed with breast cancer at 28 and was being treated dismissively by a nurse who seemed to think she was too young to have real cancer. I remembered your story, she wrote, and I realized I didn't have to accept being treated like I was making a big deal out of nothing. I reported the nurse to the patient advocate, and she was reassigned. My new nurse treats me like a human being, and I truly believe the improved care has helped my recovery. Thank you for showing me that patients have power too, even when we don't feel powerful. That letter is framed on my office wall, next to my nursing degree and my certificate of remission from Dr. Martinez. It reminds me every day why I survived not just the cancer, but everything that came with it. I didn't survive to get revenge on Patricia or Michael. I survived to become someone who could prevent other patients from experiencing what I experienced. I survived to prove that healthcare can be both excellent and compassionate, that being sick doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that sometimes the people who try to convince you you're powerless are the ones who are most afraid of your strength. 3 years ago, Patricia whispered that I'd die soon anyway, confident that my weakness made me disposable. She was wrong about almost everything, my prognosis, my strength, my willingness to fight back. But she was right about one thing: the person I was in that hospital bed did die. The woman who accepted dismissive treatment, who made excuses for unprofessional behavior, who prioritized being liked over being respected, she didn't survive the experience. In her place is someone stronger, clearer, more determined to use whatever time she has left to make the world a little more just for the people who need justice most. And that person is very much alive, very much thriving, and very much committed to ensuring that no patient ever again has to hear a healthcare provider whisper that they'll die soon anyway. Because sometimes the best revenge isn't revenge at all. Sometimes it's simply becoming the person your enemies never thought you could be. Sometimes it's living so fully, so purposefully, so compassionately that their cruelty becomes just a footnote in your story of survival and transformation. And sometimes, when you're really lucky, it's discovering that surviving the worst thing that ever happened to you can become the foundation for the best thing you ever do. 3 years later, I can honestly say that getting cancer was the worst thing that ever happened to me. And fighting back against the people who tried to use my illness against me was one of the best. Not because revenge feels good, though I won't lie, there was satisfaction in watching Patricia face consequences for her actions. But because fighting back taught me that I was stronger than I'd ever imagined, more resilient than I'd ever needed to be, and more capable of creating positive change than I'd ever dared to hope. Today, when I walk through the halls of St. Mary's Hospital, I sometimes pass room 314. There's usually a patient there, maybe scared, maybe alone, maybe fighting the battle of their life while people around them make assumptions about their strength, their prognosis, their worth. I always stop and introduce myself. I let them know that there's someone in the hospital whose job is to make sure they're treated with dignity and respect. I give them my card and tell them to call if anyone makes them feel like their concerns don't matter. And sometimes, when they seem particularly frightened or defeated, I tell them a story about a patient who was once told she'd die soon anyway by a nurse who underestimated her strength. I tell them how that patient decided to live not just to prove the nurse wrong, but to prove to herself that she was worth fighting for. I tell them that being sick doesn't make you weak, and being vulnerable doesn't make you powerless. And I tell them that sometimes the best medicine isn't what they put in your four, it's remembering that you're worth fighting for, even when the people around you forget. Most of all, I tell them that their life has value that no one else gets to determine. Not their diagnosis. Not their prognosis. Not the people who are supposed to care for them but sometimes lose sight of what caring really means. Their life has value because they're human beings who deserve dignity, respect, and the best care possible for as long as they're fighting for it. And if anyone suggests otherwise, if anyone whispers that they'll die soon anyway, they have the right to prove them spectacularly, permanently, beautifully wrong. Just like I did. The end. If this story resonates with you, you're not alone. Medical advocacy is something every patient has the right to, but many people don't realize they can speak up when they're being treated poorly by healthcare providers. Remember, being sick doesn't mean you have to accept being treated with anything less than dignity and respect. Have you ever had to advocate for yourself or a loved one in a medical setting? What gave you the strength to speak up when you felt powerless? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might give someone else the courage they need. Healthcare should heal both the body and the spirit. When providers forget that patients are human beings deserving of compassion, it's not just unprofessional, it's harmful to the healing process itself. If you enjoyed this story of turning vulnerability into strength, make sure to subscribe for more real-life tales of justice, resilience, and the power of refusing to be silenced. Hit that notification bell. Trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next.